Hello, everyone. Welcome to Keys to Real Estate. I'm your host, Mary Schuster. So, I've been thinking about a corner of our world that many of us just don't have a lot of insight into, and that's the role and world of the appraiser in real estate transaction. Now, there's a lot of change in the business of doing appraisals right now, and if you are an appraiser yourself or are thinking of becoming one, we have some nitty-gritty details for you today. But don't worry if your job is elsewhere in the transaction, because we have some more general discussions for you too. Because say what you will, everyone in the entire transaction is impacted by the decisions and actions of the appraisers. Plus, it's just always good to be aware of what your industry partners are experiencing. So I've called in two experts today to help break it all down for us. Our guest today is Senior Residential Appraiser Margaret Nelson-Quin. And she's the owner of Phoenix Appraisal Network and is active in teaching and training in the world of appraisal. And also, I just love how her passion for and commitment to the industry really shine through. And co-hosting today to help with some of the more intricate topics is the editor of our Valuation Review publication, which covers everything worth knowing on the appraisal side of the street, Mr. Mike Holzheimer. So please enjoy this peek into an early and important step in nearly every transaction you'll encounter, the wonderful world of appraisals. The presenting sponsor of the Keys to Real Estate podcast is RamQuest. RamQuest fosters a customer-first culture built around an unwavering commitment to provide solutions that don't just meet but exceed expectations. RamQuest's newest title and settlement production solution, Horizon, delivers unparalleled efficiency, robust features, and scalability to ensure you have tools to boost productivity and elevate performance like never before. Horizon streamlines your operation with secure 24/7 access, automatic updates, and all the power that only the cloud can offer. Plus, Horizon offers a direct connection to the industry's most extensive network of service providers and partners. Experience Horizon for yourself when you visit ramquest.com. And now, please enjoy the show. Margaret and Mike, welcome to Keys to Real Estate. I'm so glad you're both here. Listen, our audience tends to be comprised of people throughout the entire real estate ecosystem, many of whom are appraisers, and many of others who are aware that the appraisal world exists and roughly what goes on in it. But there are some things to be aware of that are changing now, and some things we should understand about the fundamentals of the business. And so Margaret is our expert here today on all things appraisal. We're so thrilled to have you. And I wanted to kick off, if I could, by asking on behalf of the other stakeholders in the business that aren't appraisals. I think we all have a general sense of what an appraisal is, but I don't think we've stopped to think about why appraisals exist. What's the purpose?
Thanks, Mary. I appreciate being here. I'm pretty excited actually to be talking about appraisal. It's one of my favorite topics. The purpose for an appraiser to be in the financing transaction is to introduce somebody who can be objective, who can take both the typical buyer and typical seller's perspective, and to create a valuation based on that perspective. Many of the players in a financing transaction are focused either on the seller or the buyer. There's a lot of emotion that comes in on both of those sides of the transaction, and the appraiser stands in the middle, reviews and analyzes the data, historic data, and then determines what a typical buyer or a typical seller would be doing in the transaction. So that's why.
Take some of that passion out and
That's
try
right.
to make it a little more of a measure of not necessarily that the value is what this person is willing to pay, but is it a good value overall? That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for humoring me with that kind of entry level question. As I mentioned at the top, Mike is here. He's our editor of our Valuation Review publication, and he's the other expert in this conversation. So, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you for a real smart appraisal discussion.
Well, thank you, Mary. I'm not expert, but in my time here at October Research, done a lot of research on the appraisal industry First of all, thank you, Mary, for having me on the podcast. And Margaret, a pleasure to meet you virtually. And thank you for your insight today. And I think a few topics I'm just going to address that I think will be of interest to those who are watching and listening. We're going to get into the technology area of appraising, and based on what people have told me, my guests and my sources for my stories, people who I have talked to, having traveled to many conferences, on the subject of PAREA, the alternative model, the practical applications of real estate appraisal. Of course, that's the Appraisal Foundation's gem, if you will, created by the Appraiser Qualifications Board. It's basically, in most people's opinion, Margaret, a real game changer for the industry. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that as a way to bring appraisers in and have them use this model to get their education credentials and to basically have a different way, a more efficient way to appraise property. Some say it may not be a game changer. What are your thoughts?
I absolutely think it's a game changer, Mike. I think that providing an opportunity for people who would not otherwise be able to tolerate some of the timelines for being able to get into the industry in terms of finding a supervisor or maybe being remote and having to travel someplace else to be able to get their experience hours. PAREA is absolutely a game changer. It opens the door for so many other people than, if you look at the median age of the appraiser right now, it's somewhere between 47 and 52 or something like that. And, that's tough for an industry to not be able to attract a younger demographic. And I think PAREA is going to move us into that realm, create an opportunity for people who are very adept at technology and very capable of learning online. For me, I'd rather be sitting in a classroom with my peers learning something, but I talk to people every day who don't want to do that. They'd rather be online. That's their sweet spot. And so I'm excited to be able to bring in that demographic into appraisal. I think they'll bring a whole new perspective on us. Some of the challenges that I and my peers have about the system, the PAREA system, is that there's not constant mentorship. It's a periodic mentorship, and the mentors are provided with a stipend, and which is not particularly appealing to somebody like myself when I could be training somebody firsthand and making a cut from whatever they're helping me to bring in the shop. Otherwise, I think it's a tremendous game changer, and I'm very excited about it.
I agree with all that, Margaret. And I think, as we're seeing more states adopt a PAREA, there's obviously interest. People want to
Yes.
move forward.
Yes.
And while this may not be new technology, I think it's unique technology. And that causes me to stop and think that with using unique technology, interesting ways, that might be something that will entice the new blood to come into the profession, because the industry is constantly trying to break down those barriers. They want to get more people in.
Yeah.
Is PAREA one way of doing that?
Absolutely. Many of my peers I'm in my 60s, and many of my peers are not as interested in all of the technology that it requires to be an appraiser today, and bringing younger people into the industry who don't even think a second time about taking camera photos with their camera or doing the appraisal on their cameras, which is certainly something that we can do these days. I think that's exciting, and it certainly is going to help clear out the pipeline, because that's one of the biggest challenges that we've been looking at, is how to provide enough appraisal product for the demand.
Absolutely. And like I say, the appraisal profession constantly changes, and
Yes.
and so does the technology. And with
Yes.
that change comes opportunity. And I
Yes.
think that's what we have to keep in mind also. Another topic we want to get into a little bit, the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they're to talk about change or talk about updates. Appraisers are constantly getting information about what they now have to do, what they have to change to remain compliant. The new forms that are coming out, the UAD, the forms redesign, maybe becoming a little bit more narrative and kind of getting away from the checking the box, if you will. What is your perspective right now as far as what Fannie and Freddie are doing for the industry? Is it enough, and are these changes for the better?
Actually, I think this change is absolutely for the better. We saw a similar change when we adopted UAD in the 2009-10 timeframe, and that occurred to help make the data that was available more concise, to try to make the data more consistent. And that's hard when you have a bunch of independent appraiser types creating appraisals in a form. And for me in particular, this comes up because I do a lot of unique rural properties. And so the forms don't always fit the property that I'm doing. And I have to do a lot of narrative commentary to be able to get the story about the property across. And the new forms, if something isn't typical, if something doesn't comply, it forces the appraiser to have commentary. And in my many years of doing appraisal review, that's the one thing that I have seen that is missing in many rural reports, in particular, some subdivision type reports, mostly in rural reports, that commentary discussing why something might not be highest and best use compliant or zoning compliant is just missing. And so the good thing is that we'll have that data. The GSEs will have that data when they're making decisions. It also will allow them to make comparisons between the data that I'm providing, the data that the next appraiser is providing, and it will be online real time, which is a good thing instead of having to wait for down the line property to have difficulty and the lender to come back and go, well, this appraiser said this about it. And Fannie Mae can say, yeah, but it really was this. So now they'll have it sitting right next to each other, right next to the data they already have about a property, and it can be a real-time kind of thing. And the system can say, oh, we have data that says this about this property. Why are you saying that?
Right. The impressions that I've been getting and the feel from talking to people is that this is going to truly allow the appraisers to do what they need to do and what everybody is looking for, and that is to explain where you got your opinion of value or your determination. It's not enough just to state something. Well, where did you get it? How did you arrive at that? And these forms will allow the appraiser to do just that. Again, it also speaks to making sure the appraiser's work file is updated and accurate and has everything in there that you need. You know, the old adage, if you can say it in 3 words, don't use 4. But in this case, the more information, the better. It's better to have more than to have someone question something and then have it go back for review. So I think this is going to allow the appraiser to, again, state their work and show how they arrived at that decision. And the work files have become so important. Yes. And I know I talk to a lot of people that say that they see certain things missing in work files. What do you see as far as work files? What needs to be in there? What appraisers should make sure this is a must?
I think the most important thing to remember about the appraiser's work file is that it needs to include all of the support for the work that we produce. And just recently took a class from Richard Hager, and he was going over the kinds of things that we have a tendency to leave out of our work files. And when we're moving real fast and we're moving from this job to the next job, and it's so easy to not remember to move all the data forward into each file. And as we become more digitally adept, that becomes easier and easier. When we had work files in boxes in the garage, it was harder to go out and get that information and make sure it was in the next work file or there was a reference to it. But now that it's digital, it's easy to just grab all of your Excel data and put it into that next work file.
Support for today's episode is provided by October Research. October Research provides national coverage of case law, news, regulatory updates, and competitive business strategies critical for sustaining an innovative and compliant real estate business operation. Our portfolio publications offer independent and unbiased information that helps you stay educated and informed on what matters most to your business. So visit octoberresearch.com to learn more about our portfolio of real estate publications, sign up for free email news, educational webinars, and premier industry events for thought leaders. Knowledge, the competitive advantage.
Well, let's close with another technology subject matter here that, of course, is on a lot of people's minds. It's extremely relevant. In fact, I am currently researching and putting together Valuation Reviews and October Research's annual Appraisal Technology Special Report. And artificial intelligence is at the forefront.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of opinions out there. You talk about a game changer. Here's something else. Let me just ask you, as far as from what you've seen thus far, where is artificial intelligence and how has it thus far impacted the profession? And where do you see this going moving forward?
I think the way that many people think about artificial intelligence right now has to do with creating commentary. I mean, you see that all the time with influencers, and appraisers have been using artificial intelligence for a long time, certainly since 2009-10, when we began to implement systems for the AMCs and then our software that said, well, you said this here, and why are you saying something different over here? So creating better consistency, checking with doctrines and policies and rules to make sure that we're following all the rules. So we've been using it for a long time. And so it's exciting, though, to be looking at what's happening specifically with the GSEs and being able to implement more in depth. So when we have a text commentary, we can actually use some kind of artificial intelligence to bring in and help us research. And that's the place that I think is going to be very helpful and cut our time.
And one of the concerns that seems to be common amongst a lot of people that I've talked to, and certainly within the industry, is the reliability. But that could also be a concern when you're talking about AVMs and what information is spitting out. It all comes down to, again, the appraiser, their critical thinking, their knowledge, their research, their knowledge of the market. They are valuing a certain property in. They're not going to be replaced. At the end of the day, they have to be that person, the boots on the ground, the critical thinker that will validate such information that comes from the technology, in particular AI.
Well, I can tell you that I was an early adopter of Excel in my appraisals. And what I know for a fact is I can do Excel analysis all day long, but in the end, it requires me, who knows the market, who knows the property type, who knows the buyer and seller based on my analysis and experience, to say, yeah, that's what those numbers show. But in my conversations with brokers and my conversations with buyers and sellers, that's not exactly right. And we've always say that appraisal is part art and part science. And it requires, as you said, somebody who understands the market. That's why we have to be compliant. That's why we have to refuse jobs if we're not geographically compliant, because it requires us to know, is there a brownfield over there that you can't see with your eyes, but if you've lived here long enough, you know about? And those are the kinds of things that we are always going to be needed for.
Absolutely. Well, Margaret, thanks so much for that insight. This is really terrific. And I know our audience of appraisers will certainly benefit from that. I know I did. I certainly learned something as well. Well, I think, Mary, I'm going to toss this back to you as far as the topic of tighter lending thresholds.
Yes, I have a couple of other questions, Margaret, before you go. For the larger real estate ecosystem, yes, tighter lending thresholds, they're impacting everybody throughout the transaction. I'd love to hear specifically how they're impacting the world of appraisals.
Boy, lots of different ways. The first way is the same way that everybody else is being impacted, and that is that people are not able to get loans. And whether it has to do with sellers who are not putting their properties on the market, or buyers who are not able to get loans because of tighter lending. So it's impacting us that way. But the other thing that's happening, and that's some of the other changes in terms of the regulations that are happening in the industry, getting the information. And so when you have a tighter lending environment, or a lending environment that is less favorable for buyers and sellers, it impacts the whole system, right? So the brokers, the appraisers, the lenders, the title companies, because we're all trying to make sure that the information that we have, and that's what happens with appraisers, is in a more challenging lending situation. Everybody is watching who they're watching confidentiality. They're trying to make sure that they're not exposing anybody to any kind of liability by providing information that they shouldn't be. And those are the kinds of things that we find we don't have as much data to use. And so then we have to do more analysis. We have to talk to more people. And the folks that we're talking to are really hesitant to talk to us because they know that we're outside of the loop and that we're going to be using the data that they provide us. And those are the kinds of things that appraisers find are challenging in times where it's tighter lending.
Are there different types of alternative financing
Yes.
coming into play in your world? Are we
Yes.
seeing seller carrybacks, private money? What's
Right.
that looking like in your world?
In the context of appraisal, what we do is we compare properties and how they sold. So the conditions of the sale. And the conditions of the sale have to do with financing. So could they get conventional financing? Was it available for this property type? Was the financing environment so bad that they couldn't get financing? And how did they do that? And then seller financing coming into play where sellers really want to be able to sell their property. And so then they look at alternative ways to be able to get buyers in the door. So they're willing to take back the loan. So we're seeing more seller financing happen. We're also seeing, the other day I saw one that was a seller equity financing. So in other words, the seller was, it's almost like signing off, being a partner in the loan. And then with the understanding that eventually in the next 2 or 3 years, they would be bought out by the buyer, hopefully when market conditions change. And for appraisers, we need to be able to adjust for those and those differences, right? So whether something's conventional or sells for cash or sells with seller financing, and that kind of goes back to how do we get that information? That's another challenge that we face in the environment where financing is more strict. But I tell you, most of us, if you think about our age, most of us have been doing it long enough that we've figured out we went through the last downturn and we know, and we're beginning to see that happening. First of all, people don't buy because they don't know what's happening. And then eventually they say, well, what if we did this? And so they just find alternatives. And that's essentially what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, yeah, I wondered about that. Another thing that the larger ecosystem as a whole is trying to understand and incorporate is, well, I guess we call it broker compensation now. We're all trying to unlearn the commissions phrase. That one's going to take a while, but everybody's trying to deal with that. Is there impact on the appraisal world with that, or are you immune?
Yes, no, it has a similar impact that I was just talking about. That there has been enough litigation in the brokerage world that they're being very sensitive to who they are providing information to. And what we will be as appraisers having to do is figure out who's paying who what. Is the seller paying both compensation to the buyer and seller's agent? Is the buyer paying for part of this? And how does that impact the price? How does that impact the sale price? And once again, we're responsible as appraisers to figure that out and consider, are those conditions of sale similar to those conditions of sales over there? And to make those differences and adjustments for those differences. And that's the biggest challenge that I see. I mean, we've had brokerages just literally in the last week who I reached out to, and they said, I'm sorry, we can't share any of that information with you. And I understand why they're saying that. They're trying to do everything they can to protect their interest and their buyer's interest and their seller's interest.
And I'm not sure that was an outcome of these cases that was really thought all the way through as these cases were settling, that it would impact valuations.
In conversations with my peers, though, and I count the brokers as my peers as well as the appraisers, it just means that we have to be more cohesive in our relationships. And appraisal and real estate sales have always worked hand in hand. We are reliant, and lenders, we're always reliant upon each other for the work that we do, and creating those relationships where brokers know they can trust me. I know I can trust brokers to tell me the truth. Those are the kinds of things that we just have to go back to the basics essentially and create those. So I get to start going to more caravans and reaching out to brokers and sitting next to them at meetings and making sure that they know I'm somebody who also understands their perspective. I mean, that's essentially what we have to do.
Wow, I had really not thought that one through myself. So in that regard, it's a little bit of was old is new again. I mean, with the whole going on caravans, and I mean that sounds like from back in the day when I started. That's incredible. All right, one more thing. I know we've kept you a while. collectively, people are starting to really look at zoning and zoning changes. And do we have for example, too much empty commercial space that we could repurpose for something else? Or are we overly zoned or improperly zoned in an area as people try to continue to solve this housing shortage equation? I wondered if you had some topics that you're looking at and thinking about in regard to that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a big deal right now. One of the biggest challenges in the context of being able to get appraisals is when zoning is changed to accommodate more multifamily or multi-unit housing. If a state or a municipality changes the zoning to allow more than 4 units on what used to be a single family lot, it prohibits the appraisal from being done by a residential appraiser. And there are many people at this point, because we really haven't seen the rubber hit the road yet, who are saying, oh, I don't think it's going to be a big deal. But I have a colleague in Washington who has had to stop appraising in a city. So not just an area, but a whole city, because the zoning regulations have changed to the point where if they appraise a single family lot, what used to be a single family lot that now could have up to 6 units on it, they are prohibited from appraising that just by the state regulations. And so that's the challenge from the appraisal perspective that we're going to find. I think we're going to be bumping around in this realm and trying to figure this all out for some time, but I'm glad we're moving forward with it. In our area in particular, we saw that really up close and personal. We had some big fires in 2020, which decimated whole cities. And prior to the fires, the municipalities had changed the zoning. When people started to rebuild, they were able to build 11-unit apartment buildings right next to single-family dwellings, existing single-family dwellings. And it created all sorts of turmoil, some of which being, now that that's can have an 11-unit apartment building, can somebody who's a residential appraiser actually still appraise that? And so it's the same kind of consideration, and we just need to work it out. I'm glad we're moving forward with it, and I'm glad that municipalities are jumping into this and trying to solve the issues. We just need to figure out what the best solution is.
Well, it's interesting. It's such a fascinating time because you'd think with transaction volumes being lower than they've been in quite some time that it would be a relatively quiet time in the real estate industry. But with all these changes,
Yes.
both prescribed and in some sort of attempt to respond to
Yes.
the sluggishness,
Yeah.
it's just such a period of fast change throughout the entire chain of
Yep.
stakeholders in the whole community of it, that I
Yeah.
just really appreciate you both joining and sharing, shining a light on this piece of the transaction that sometimes I think gets taken for granted. I think you guys are a little bit like our title and settlement audience members in that people just take it for granted that you're kind of quiet over there in the background, just doing your thing and not understanding the churn of change that's really going on and what you're trying to keep up with.
Exactly.
Well,
Agreed.
we appreciate you helping our audience get a glimpse of that, and we're going to keep them dialed in and abreast of the changes, and keep bringing this sorts of information. Again, whether a listener is an appraiser themselves or not, you guys are so early in the food chain of getting to closing that I really wanted to shine a light on some of the activity going on that is impacting all the way down the chain of dominoes. So thank you both. We appreciate your lending your expertise.
Mary, thank you for having me. I was really excited that you're bringing this topic up.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike.
Thanks again so much, Mike and Margaret. I find this critical piece of the puzzle of all the work we do in tandem together to be really fascinating. And it sounds like we're going to be learning and incorporating many new changes together for a while. So, viewers and listeners, both Mike and Margaret's contact information are linked in today's show notes. I'm sure either or both of them would love to answer any questions you have. And I know Mike would love the opportunity to help you stay informed via his coverage in the valuation review right here from October Research. So until next time, keep your eyes open and your ears to the ground for change because it's going on all around us. It's happening everywhere. And I'll be back next week with another new guest, an important conversation that will help you continue to confidently hold your keys to real estate. I'm Mary Schuster for October Research, where knowledge is the competitive advantage.